Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I know that most of you, like myself, have been focused when it comes to the news primarily on what's going on with Ukraine. Certainly a horrific situation has arisen there. But there are other stories, there are other news. And I like to try and get a sort of a very good cross-section of the news from different places in the world. And as you know, this past Wednesday night, Thursday, we celebrated Purim. Beautiful event, thanks to our Chazan. Where's our Chazan? Oh, it's magnificent. And there was a story that's been popping up both in Israeli and foreign newspapers. The story of how the Jewish people of Iran purchased in 1971 the tomb of two of the focal individuals in the story of Purim, namely Mordechai and Esther. And the more I read this story, and I read it in a number of papers, the more I started thinking to myself, something doesn't seem quite right here. So let's do a little bit more digging. Now, you know as well as I do that the Purim story is one of the Bible stories for which there is absolutely no external evidence. We've discussed this before. It's a great story, and it has a critically important message. And as I shared with you last week, there is evil in the world. Every generation has its Haman. And therefore we must be vigilant. But the lack of evidence for any of the characters in the story, with the exception of Achashverosh, who has been identified with the Persian king Xerxes, as well as certain features of the text, has led most scholars, most theologians, to conclude that the story is a parable, something to teach us a moral lesson, not a historic lesson. I spoke last year on Purim about how it connected us and allowed the Jews of Iran at the time, or Persia I should say, to celebrate with their non-Jewish counterparts without violating Torah law. I'm not going to go into that again. And it's not heresy to say that Esther, a book of the Bible, is parable. Why do I say that? I'll tell you why. Because one of the rabbis of the Talmud said that the story of Job, another book of the Bible, never happened. And you know what? In the 11th century, Maimonides, Rambam, agreed with him. But if the story never happened, then why did the Jews of Iran purchase the tomb of Mordechai and Esther from the Shah of Iran in 1971? Now, in honor of Purim, the National Library of Israel has been displaying an exchange of letters between Jewish members of the Majlis. The Majlis is the Iranian parliament, and the government of Iran on the subject of the Jewish community purchasing the tomb, which is located in a city called Hamadan. Now, Hamadan is a city of about 800,000 people, and it's located approximately 360 kilometers southwest of Tehran. The correspondence starts with a letter from the then Director General of Archaeology and Public Education to the representative of the Iranian Jewish community in the Majlis. Now, you've got to understand one thing, and even to this day, despite the hostile rhetoric Iran casts at Israel, there is to this very day a designated Jewish seat in Iran's parliament. so that the Jews of Iran have a voice. Sounds very democratic, right? Anyhow, the Director General proposed that the Jewish community purchase the tomb of Mordechai and Esther from a bank that owned it at the time. And he suggested that the purchase could be funded by selling tickets to visit the site. The timing of the letter is what's very interesting. The timing was driven by a desire to tie to the 2500th anniversary of the Edict of Cyrus. I mentioned this a few weeks ago. Cyrus, by royal command, gave the Jews permission to rebuild the temple. Who was Cyrus? Cyrus was the great founder of the first Persian Empire. Now, the late Shah, Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, liked to fashion himself as the new and modern Cyrus. He had very close relationships with Israel. Israel did a lot of the construction in Tehran, the highways, the byways, the buildings. Solel Boneh was one of the great builders at the time in Tehran. Now, according to the correspondence, the deal was finalized in 1970. But what is it that they actually purchased? Could it be the actual tomb of Mordechai and Esther? It seems somewhat unlikely. The earliest mention of Mordechai and Esther being buried in Hamadan is in the 12th century. It's in a letter from Benjamin of Tudela, the Jewish travel writer of his day. And he writes as follows: "From that mount to Hamadan is a journey of 10 days, and this was the metropolis of Media and contains about 50,000 Jews. In front of one of the synagogues is the sepulchre of Mordecai and Esther," in the 12th century. The 12th century, the problem with that is that the 12th century is approximately 1700 years after the story would have taken place. So you would likely think that we would have record before that. And furthermore, the building itself, archaeologists have tested it, and the building, it seems to have been built in the 1600s. Not surprisingly, the Persian Jews have a lot of stories and traditions about Mordechai and Esther. After all, they've got to sell the tickets to raise the money to pay back to the bank, including one which says that they died in the synagogue behind the mausoleum within an hour of each other. Now, the tomb of Mordechai and Esther is not the only pilgrimage site that we have in Judaism which has doubtful provenance. Another one, believe it or not, and don't throw anything at me, okay, because hear me first. The other one is the tomb of King David in Jerusalem. It's another such site, another place that the peripatetic Benjamin of Tudela visited. And he recounted this very colorful tale that two Jewish workers who were hired to dig a tunnel came across King David's palace, complete with a scepter of gold and a gold crown, and decided this must be his tomb. However, a little bit of further digging revealed that the actual structure on the site was a Byzantine-era church from the 5th or the 6th century. Yes, we have records showing at first people believed that David was buried in the city of David. But then in the 4th century, they thought he was buried in Bethlehem. And the idea that he was buried on Mount Zion doesn't appear until the 9th century. And of course, Jews aren't the only people who designate a specific site for religious important events that happened hundreds or even thousands of years earlier with, shall we say, dubious accuracy. Have any of you heard here of the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem? The Via Dolorosa, I'm sure you have. What does it mean? The path of sorrows, which leads to Franciscan covenant of the flagellation in Jerusalem. to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Catholic's world's holiest site, which contains the last 5 stations of the cross. This path is supposed to follow the path that Jesus walked from his condemnation to his execution to being set in a tomb. Now, according to the Coptic Christians, Constantine's mother, Helena, discovered the path, or was shown it by sort of a local guides in the 4th century, which of course was 300 years after the death of Jesus. And from the first recorded such pilgrimage route in the Byzantine era through the 18th century, the route was changed several times, indicating that no one really knows where it was. I remember being there, it's got to be like 20 years ago, and I was listening to a guide who was guiding some Christian travelers saying, this is the site that Jesus walked with the cross on his shoulder. And I remember saying to the guide, are you actually telling us that it was on this, I'm standing on the very site where Jesus was? And he said, well, maybe not on the very site, but it's close as we have. Protestants don't agree with the location of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at all. They believe Jesus' crucifixion happened at a different location, known as the Garden Tomb, north of the current city walls. And what about the Muslims? The Muslims have a place they revere as the burial place of Moses. Although the Torah tells us that God buried Moses and nobody knows the location. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, when we're listening to all of this, what is so important about having a specific place? Why the seeming obsession with finding a physical place to tie religious events to, such as the tomb of Mordechai and Esther? Is it really going to change anything? And here's what I believe it is. The human imagination is stirred by the idea of being at a place where important events happened. People make pilgrimages to holy places so that they can feel the energy of events that transpired long ago. Visiting the Western Wall can be a religious experience for many people because it's at the site of the temple, the outer wall of the temple. A location that has been the focal point of Judaism for thousands of years. The Talmud tells us, outside Israel, we pray facing Israel. In Israel, we pray facing Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, we pray facing the Temple Mount. Also, I don't know if any of you have been there, but visiting the Ma'arat Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are supposed to be buried, can provide an opportunity to feel a connection to our patriarchs and our matriarchs, our spiritual ancestors going back thousands of years ago. Although there is a disagreement about some of the residents of the cave, there is Jewish tradition that Adam and Eve are buried there, while Catholics believe Adam is buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And given what we know of evolution, it is believed that our common male ancestor lived approximately 270,000 years ago, not 5,782 years ago. And he likely was not named Adam, but we're not going to get into that now. That's a whole another lecture. Of course, it's impossible to prove that these things didn't happen in these places. As Mark Twain wrote about visiting Adam's purported resting place in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, this is what he wrote. Not far from the illustrious column Adam himself, the father of the human race lies buried. There is no question that he is actually buried in the grave, which is pointed out as his grave. There can be none. And there can be none because it has never yet been proven that the grave is not the grave in which he is buried. I guess he studied Talmud, Mark Twain. How he's able to argue and counter-argue. So going back to the Jews of Iran. The Jews of Iran bought that site in Hamadan because the place is important to them. Even if Mordechai and Esther aren't actually buried there, for hundreds of years, Persian Jews have made pilgrimage to that place as if they were. And that alone makes the space sacred, even if not holy. Similarly, our connection place, and specifically to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, is the reason the early Zionists rejected what was called Tochnit Uganda, which was a proposal by the British to the Zionists that the British government would give them a piece of land in Africa called Uganda to build their holy land. And it was rejected. It was rejected on the basis that Zionism wasn't only about having a home for the Jewish people. Because if that's what it was all about, then they could have lived anywhere. There was even thought about Madagascar at one point. But it was about returning to a specific place, our home, the home of the Jewish people, the place where God promised to Abraham in the covenantal relationship that he will give it to him. That's what makes it important. So, do I have to prove that Mordechai and Esther are buried in Hamadan? And the answer is no. I don't know that they're not, just like I don't know that they are. And so that place will continue to be a holy pilgrimage for Jews, providing the Iranians do not carry out their recent threat of leveling the place and building a Palestinian embassy. Shabbat Shalom. We continue now with our Musaf service, first with the Chatzi Kaddish. Please rise.
יתגדל ויתקדש